Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem Zen, and today's guest is a meditation teacher, a podcaster, and an artist. He has extensive experience in contemplative and spiritual disciplines, elite athletic performance, extreme outdoor survival, and human behavior. His vast array of abilities doesn't stop there, as his original music was featured in several Netflix series. He's also the host of the Guru Viking podcast, where he interviews some of the most prolific spiritual teachers and practitioners from all around the world. Steve James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Artem. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the podcast, which I hope we can talk about a little bit later. But first, I'd love it if you could share a little bit about your upbringing and your background and maybe some of the pivotal and formative events that shaped you into the person that you are today.
Wow. Pivotal events, goodness. Well, the brief, I was born in a little village in Scotland, and I grew up on a small Scottish island called Shetland Islands. It's actually very far north. If you go up towards Norway, that's the direction it is. And it's a selection of islands there. Oh, we have the little Shetland ponies. They come from there. Yeah, so I grew up there on the little Shetland Islands. And I guess in terms of the podcast and my interest in things like meditation, etc., my upbringing was quite standard, I think. Two main influences were martial arts. From a very young age, 5 years old, I started attending karate class. And that was quite a traditionally minded karate class. And we did a lot of standing with one arm out and for 5 minutes, which when you're 5 seems like just like in the movies, just facing the edge of your ability, that kind of thing. And we did a lot of things like we did a bit of meditation actually also, sort of kneeling in Seiza, they call it. We'd be sparring towards the end of a session, which is sort of mock fighting. And of course, you get very tired and knackered doing that. And then suddenly the teacher would say, Seiza, and we'd kneel down and do various exercises to control our breathing. When we were hungry for more oxygen, we'd have to slow our breathing down. And, we did this sort of thing. So, of course, I loved it and fell hook, line, and sinker for it, as young boys can do. So I fell in love with that and got really into martial arts and so on, and read everything I could on it and practiced a lot and so on. And, of course, that sort of reading about martial arts, you read about karate, you end up reading about the do part of karate do, the way, and you end up reading about Japanese culture, religion, etc. And then you're off into the whole realm of contemplative and mystical subjects. So I was off in that direction. And also from around that same age, I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church. And so that was interesting too, because my mother had this phrase that it was like she would say, it's a private faith. That was the phrase she would say, private faith. So that meant when we attended the Mass, which is the ritual, the weekly ritual of the Catholic religion, it wasn't in order to get together with people who believed the same thing to celebrate that we all believed the same thing. Or it wasn't to play music with guitars and kind of like a concert. Actually, we went to the very early morning Mass, but there was no music, so that I could go to fencing later in the day, actually. But anyway, and it was very quiet. And what the altar boy does is you participate in this Mass, and it's very choreographed. So you pick up a candle here and you move it over there, and you take the cup from this place and you bring it to the priest and he does a thing and then you take it away. So you're kind of an assistant in that, but it's all very choreographed. And there are quite large periods of time where you're just sort of sitting at the back in stillness, or kneeling in some alcove or other, waiting for your next bit of candle carrying, whatever it is. And I also loved that. So we didn't get much indoctrination, or any indoctrination, actually. My mother wouldn't let us go to the Sunday school, or the catechism, which is where the children go off into another room and someone teaches them about the religion, etc. We didn't do that. She said that, much like the joke about politicians, if you want to be one, you probably shouldn't. That should be enough to disqualify you from being one. I think sort of echoing sort of Thucydides in a way. But So she didn't want us to go over there with the people who were volunteering to indoctrinate us. So we didn't, my brother and I. And it was mostly about the ritual and the silence and the space. So that, I think, also connected either with a kind of sense of the contemplative in me, or maybe even sparked it or generated it, who knows. But I really love that as well. So I think these two early influences were quite key to my eventually becoming interested in the sorts of things that led to the podcast.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I actually haven't heard a story of such a mild Catholic upbringing. It's usually a lot more extreme, and it seems like yours was more mild, and it seems like you got the positive things of the tradition.
Yes. I mean, I've had my run-ins with the negative sides of organized religion too, as we hear those stories, don't we? And certainly on my podcast, I've interviewed lots and lots of, Zen priests, Tibetan lamas. I mean, but they're Americans or European men and women who've entered, those orders, and many of them grew up in a Catholic situation that some of them didn't have a bad time of it necessarily. Many of them did, but they all report a lack of something, a lack of the direct experience of contemplative things. By contemplative here, I mean sort of, meditation-y kind of stuff, spiritual, I suppose people would say, right? A kind of a lack of contact with that, a lack of guidance or technique, or even a lack of acknowledging that reality or that aspect of human experience at all. In a church, of all things, you'd think that would be a place where one could discover at least a quiet personal connection to that sort of thing. But no, actually, often it's sort of denied in many of those sorts of formal religious contexts. And I've heard many of my guests lament that. And I've asked them, actually, if you'd had that connection, do you think you would have become a Buddhist priest, a Zen priest, or do you think you would have ended up becoming whatever it is, a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, for example? And I think that's an interesting thing to explore. So anyway, I was lucky in the sense that I had that apparatus of contemplative engagement available to me at that age, just purely because I was very lucky with the priest. Was a very deep guy. He didn't say to meditate, but that's what you do back there. And of course, I had the martial arts training, and that was also rather more explicit about that sort of thing. So yeah, I was very lucky. You're right.
And what I find that's interesting is, even though you have had kind of a positive experience with it, it seems that you've somehow gravitated more, at least it seems to me, into the Buddhist kind of stuff, more of the Eastern traditions. So I'm curious what it was that drew you to that. I have a friend who's Catholic, and my background is kind of Jewish, and he's like, well, why didn't, and I would tell him that I'd be interested in Buddhism and stuff like that. And he's like, why didn't you get interested? Why don't you go and follow, the Jewish tradition or explore that? And I was just like, I don't know. I just kind of was, interested in the Eastern. So I'm wondering how that came about, and why you didn't pursue to go deeper into Christianity or Catholicism.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I think I went quite deep, actually, into it, certainly in later years. And I still, at that time, when I started reading, sparked by my martial arts launching pad, if you like, I didn't really see much of a conflict. Of course, I understand that the religions are not compatible in many ways, doctrinally and etc. I understand that now. But at that time, I didn't see that difference as necessarily conflict, more kind of diversity of flavors. So I read all sorts of things and found them didn't detract from each other. So in that sense, I wouldn't say I'm more interested necessarily in the Eastern paths, the Eastern religions. I'm just also very interested in them. And there was this very fascinating article. Oh, by the way, I should say there's a richness in the Western tradition too that's often unmined and overlooked. But there's an article, an essay written by Alan Watts, the famous, popularizer of Zen and other things. And it's called Beat Zen, Square Zen. And he makes many points in that essay. But one of the points he makes is that there's, at that time when he wrote that article, Zen was very hip and very popular in the States, I think. So a lot of people were drawn to it. But he had observed that there were people drawn to it for kind of two different reasons. He categorized them: the beats and the squares. The beats, and this is kind of a play on the beat poets, they liked the idea of Zen as a kind of beyond categories, beyond rules, wild kind of free-for-all of spontaneity, something like this. They, leaving their home traditions, found that that was very attractive to them. And the others, the squares, looked to the Zen tradition and saw the order, the outfits, the postures, the clean aesthetic, the lines of the Zendo, etc., and were drawn to that structure. The squares, they found there a kind of rigor, perhaps, that had been lacking in their home tradition. The point being that these people were attracted to both of these flavors, which are kind of different in a way, although perhaps Zen at its best brings them together, in reaction to what they were disliking, you could say, in their home tradition. He made the suggestion, or at least I read him to make the suggestion, that if one does not reconcile with one's home tradition, then in a sense, it's a little bit like they say in psychology, that if you don't, reconcile with your parental issues, you're doomed to play them out to some degree in the partners you select as romantic partners. And I think it can be the case that there has to be, I think at some point, perhaps a reconciliation with one's home traditions. Otherwise, one ends up simply kicking the can down the road and playing out similar patterns or reactive patterns in another context. But that's very hard to do. So, when you think, oh gosh, this other faith, this other way is so much better than the way that I came from. And it's a little bit like you say, this last relationship didn't work out, but wow, this new person is so shiny and cool. And, oh, they don't have any of the problems of the old one. And this is so great, But of course, they're not. They have all kinds of complexity to them as well that you don't know until you get to know them a bit better. But then often it's too late. And you yourself are the same. So there's an extent to which you make it yours, for better or worse. So yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome that you're able to actually look at so many different traditions and keep your mind expanded and not really collapse into one. But I do imagine that for those that did have a really negative experience, it would be difficult to, go back into the church or go back into reading the Bible if they had like a negative experience growing up with a Catholic upbringing or something like that.
Undoubtedly, yeah.
Yeah, so there's actually so many pieces to your story is very intriguing. You have the martial arts, and you have growing up and being an altar boy and going to church, and there was a lot of things that I've read on your site about you. But another intriguing aspect about you is your interest in extreme outdoor survival trainings. And you mentioned doing a 7-day no food, minimal equipment, advanced winter survival scenario, and 11-day Arctic survival expedition in the forests of Sweden in daytime temperatures of -24 degrees Celsius. Can you speak about how you got into extreme outdoor survival and how these experiences have impacted you?
Yeah, well, yeah, those were quite some adventures. I got into it, I think, because I recognized a deficiency in my understanding of, well, let's just say that area. Of course, I grew up in a rural place, so I was by no means an urban person, particularly. But I recognized that if something was to happen, or not even if something was to happen, I recognized that when I was out in nature, I didn't really know what was up and down in terms of survival. So we're talking survival here. We're not talking about, carving a spoon and, living comfortably in the nature, etc. That's another matter. It's sort of, sometimes they call that bushcraft, right? Living in nature. So I think that's a very amazing skill set too. But we're talking about survival. In what order do things kill you? What is the relationship between my body and my environment? And I learned as I began to study this area and began to train in this area with people who knew a lot about it, that a lot of the things I thought were wrong, or I'd never thought about them actually. I recognized that some people only think about these things when they're in trouble. And I witnessed that a lot. So people would suddenly, in a situation like that, on a controlled course, want to set up rabbit snares as the first thing. Because, heaven forbid we miss a meal. Well, it turns out you can go a good month without eating, and, it's not likely to kill you, although you might lose a little bit of weight that way. It's not advised. But you can actually survive quite a bit longer without food than you might think. Water, on the other hand, yeah, you're going to need some water in 3 or 4 days, or you're going to be in really big trouble. But on the other hand, how can you purify your water without fire? And on the other hand, if it's raining and you get cold, you can die of hypothermia in, say, 3 or 4 days. So maybe 3 or 4 weeks without food, perhaps longer, 3 or 4 days without water, 3 or 4 hours if you have hypothermia. So that's interesting. So that changes the order that you must proceed. It's a reality check as to the order you must proceed. You get an understanding of yourself, of the body, of one's organism, and also of one's environment. So I find that to be very interesting. Of course, the other thing that I think everyone would automatically assume, and it's true actually, is that you face your own, it's a test of psychological mettle also, and emotional fortitude. Some of these things can be a test of that. Just the discomfort in some of the most basic trainings that I attended at the very beginning, just simply the discomfort of being outside. I mean, I like to be outside, but it's the context. When you're in a kind of situation where they're training you to survive and all this sort of stuff, it's kind of uncomfortable, and you don't have the stuff you'd like, and it's you're not in control of what's happening next. It's a little bit uncomfortable. It can be a little uncomfortable. I'm talking about very early, and then of course it becomes much more uncomfortable later on. But that discomfort is clarifying, and actually, in some ways, purifying. In some ways. So I found that to be the case. So I love the skills, the understanding, and then, of course, from that comes appreciation of one's body and of nature and of the environment. There's an appreciation that comes after you get, when you get past the sort of suffering stage, as well as the test of one's, the reset and of one's comfort levels, the test of one's mental strength, voluntarily exposing oneself to discomfort like that, in a safe way, of course, is I think very beneficial. So I learned a lot of things from that. Yeah, teamwork. You learn about teamwork. You learn about leadership. You learn about group dynamics, and you learn about human psychology. What makes people break? What they look like when they're going to break? What kind of decisions they make and actions they take before they break or quit? And that sort of thing. How to rally a group, how to get things done in a group when people are diminishing in their capacities with every day. So all these sorts of things, what do you like in those situations? What do you like in a leadership contest? When you're either contesting for it because you need to wrest it off of somebody because it's going badly wrong, or perhaps you're being challenged, or this sort of thing. So how do you deal in those situations? What do you like when you haven't eaten for 3 days and you're fantasizing, as I was, about going back to the pub, hotel that I'd stayed in the night before the course began. The stay is sort of, you stay at a place before you go out there. I stayed in this sort of pub hotel. I was fantasizing about going back as I was collecting firewood through day 3. I was collecting firewood and just thinking about exactly what I would do. And I imagined going back to that pub. I would quit and go back to that pub and stay in that pub hotel. And I would not be able to tell anyone, of course, that I'd done that. And I'd have to just hide out there for a few days, and I could just cuddle under the covers and be all nice and comfortable. Of course, I could never come back to these people again who were training me. I'd have to be persona non grata there. I could never show my face. The shame would be unbearable and so on. Sort of imagine it. And I basically went to the pub. In every part of me went to that pub hotel, except my physical body, which didn't, of course, go. That sort of thing. It's great fun to explore those kinds of, explore maybe is the wrong word, to endure those kinds of limits of oneself. Yeah.
Yeah, to just see what your mind does, or how it changes, how your consciousness changes. I've never done like the extreme survival stuff, but I did not too long ago. I did a 5 day fast,
Oh, yeah.
and and my mind was just I was somehow on YouTube watching food videos. I have no clue how it just automatically happened.
Yeah.
And I do like the cold exposure stuff, like 20-minute ice baths, and that stuff
Mm.
is, yeah, it does something to me. Like it really opens my heart up, and it takes my mind somewhere else, and it makes me really grateful. And right now I'm in New York, so it's getting cold. So I usually do this stuff when it gets colder, because otherwise the ice melts really quick, and you gotta. So I'm about to start the season up, the sauna ice bath season. So it's definitely it's interesting to see what happens with the mind when you put yourself through these type of things, whether it's cold, whether it's food deprivation, and just being disoriented, being lost, being somewhere in the wilderness. And I'm curious if you ever read this book. It's called Deep Survival.
Yes, I
It's
have.
Yeah, by Lawrence Gonzalez, and I think one of the things that he speaks about there is how a big part of survival is about like beginner's mind. And I think he says that the people that are most likely to survive are actually like kids under the age of 7, and the people that are least likely to survive are kids that are over 7, like in that group, because by that point they already have these kind of mental models and representations of the world, so they can't see the world in a fresh way. And a big part of survival is just being very fresh, very in the moment, and that kind of relates back to meditation. So I can see how there's also that element that intertwines with it.
Yes. And it relates to meditation also because, you could really put your practice to the test there. Or, if you think you have a degree of, say, attainment, for example, or realization, as many of my guests on the podcast claim to have, those kinds of situations are, I think, excellent clarifiers or sharpeners of that attainment, if it's there, or just showing you where perhaps there's more work to be done. Or if you're a practitioner in general, just to place oneself in that kind of a context, it's very good for the practice. A lot of my teachers have, several of my teachers have emphasized that kind of training. I mean, not going out and doing those exact courses, but kind of training where one sits in meditation longer maybe than is comfortable, or this sort of thing. To see what one's made of, essentially, and to test one's practice against this. Is like weightlifting, isn't it? Or strength training. You get to a certain level of strength, you've got to put more weight on.
Yeah. So, are there any other extreme survival journeys that you're planning for the future? Is there any specific programs or things that you want to do?
Perhaps I'll quote one of my teachers. Actually, I'll answer that question. But perhaps I'll quote one of my teachers, Shinzen Young. It's been my main meditation teacher for the last 10 years or more. And he says, if you don't go to the monastery will come to you. And maybe the monastery will come to you even if you do go, which means it's to do with voluntarily exposing oneself to, what's inside, or, to suffering, to hardship. And then when it comes to you, because we don't ever wish it to come to you, do you? I mean, it's okay, one thing to go there and experience it, but I, for instance, I don't mind going on these sorts of experiences and courses, but I would hate to be in an actual survival situation. I would not want that to happen, a real one, But if it did, I'd say, well, I've been here before. And of course, the chances of me getting into a physical survival situation are extremely low. But what about the chances of me entering the same degree of suffering or discomfort that I experienced there? I'd say pretty high, if not inevitable. Illness, impending death, difficulty in life, stress, disappointment, failure, persecution, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. All sorts of things can happen, can't they? And we experience this, there's no news to anybody, those things. So to have gone to some of those places with one's practice, it's good. And when it comes, you're like, oh yeah, I've been here before. I know that I have some experience. I know some of the landmarks here of myself. What am I doing? Well, actually, I wanted to go to do some deep jungle survival. I have not done that before. There's a place in Guyana that does that. An ex-British military guy runs a course down there in Guyana. for deep jungle survival. I think it's a 2-week thing. I'd really like to do that. I was planning to do it, but then, pandemic came and all that sort of thing, and such trips were not possible. But that's something I'd very much like to do. Deep jungle. I'd also quite like to do desert. Those are the 3 extreme environments: desert, jungle, and Arctic. Of course, I've done Arctic, and I would, of course, like to return to the Arctic. I fell in love with the Arctic and the cold and the snow and the whole dynamic of that place. So I'd be very keen to return there. Yes, more of any of it, really. I'll sign up.
Yeah, I think I'd be down for the Arctic. I don't know about the jungle with all the mosquitoes or like the desert. That somehow I kind of fell in love with the cold, so it somehow the Arctic sounds more appealing. But I can imagine there's a lot of suffering to go around in either of those 3 scenarios.
Yeah, there's a lot of suffering, yeah, and there's a lot of beauty as well. A lot of beauty, a lot of appreciation. It's not all horrible. I mean, it's wonderful too. There are many things that are wonderful about it, but at times there are low points. There will be low points. There will be psychologically challenging parts. That's the case. So it's the case with almost anything worth doing.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You mentioned the Shinzen Young quote of you go to the monastery comes to you, and to me that's like you find the dragon in its lair and you kill the dragon, or the dragon's gonna come after you. And it seems to me like some people are more predisposed to that kind of mentality of like, I don't want to wait around. Like, I'm not gonna wait around for the bully. Like, I'm just gonna confront the bully, or I'm just gonna confront these things because I don't want to this weighing on my conscience. So I don't want to have to face this later. What do you think it is that some people end up kind of embracing that and going to the dragon's lair or going to the monastery, and other people don't do that?
I don't know what that is. I would like to imagine it's some degree of nature and nurture. Something to do with one's personality, the sort of raw materials one comes in with. And then I would imagine a degree of it is also in the nurture too, in the sort of influences one is exposed to, the sort of enculturation one has, the kinds of books one reads, or perhaps even films one watches, that sort of thing. I would guess, though, that, so I think that I would suppose probably the nature is the stronger part than the nurture, though, I would guess.
Really?
Maybe not.
That's a paradox we're going to be playing with till the end of time.
Yeah, exactly. So you're exactly right about that. Who knows the answer to that? Not me, that's for sure.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because, I mean, it's like everybody wants to be we want to be comfortable, right? We don't want to deal with suffering and pain. But I think I have a similar mentality, like what I'm hearing you say with what you were sharing about the winter survival. It's just like there's something there that, and even with meditation, like I think there's like a quote, like if you die before you die, then you don't have to die when you die. And it's like that whole path somehow, it's like coming to face your fears. It's coming to face really the ultimate fear, the fear of your death, and looking at that and somehow seeing through that or going beyond that. And that, to me, that's what liberation is really. It's like when you don't have no more that kind of survival anxiety. And like, that's what motivates me to practice. That's what motivates me to get uncomfortable and to face these kind of things. But yeah, it seems like for some reason that doesn't happen to everybody, or like, I don't know if it's like you have to get to that point or something has to happen where there's like a flip or a shift, or if it's just, a personality thing. I have no clue.
Yeah, I certainly think it can be encouraged in people. Confidence born from facing challenge. And sometimes one needs encouragement. I think a good teacher does that. A good teacher of anything builds, not only knowledge, but also maybe even passion about learning itself, or the confidence to be able to go from not knowing to knowing. That's quite a chasm, actually. Not knowing something, learning is itself. Another Shinzen quote that I like is, the body wants to be comfortable, the mind wants answers. These are two things. So to learn, to really learn, one has to become willing to marinate in ignorance to an extent, because when you first try to learn something, you can't learn it. I mean, I sometimes think of a bodybuilder, right? They go to the gym, and a bodybuilder attempts to gain strength in the gym or get bigger muscles and so on. So in order to do that, if a bodybuilder wants to feel strong all the time, then they will not get much stronger. A bodybuilder has to be willing to basically become a connoisseur of weakness, to be able to push the body into weakness towards its failure point, not too much, otherwise injury will be the result, but not too little, otherwise the adaptation will not occur. So a bodybuilder ends up having to become a connoisseur of weakness and has to hang out in that zone quite a bit. Similarly, if you want to learn something, you have to be willing to feel ignorant, because ignorance is the state that precedes knowledge and maybe even proceeds it. You know, it's like learning a language or anything else. It's first of all, one's faced with the shocking experience of not knowing the thing. And sometimes enthusiasm can carry you over that chasm. Enthusiasm, fascination, curiosity, you know, you kind of carry over that chasm. But anyway, more or less, I think it's very easy for, in terms of learning, to become very comfortable with what we already know, and then become less and less accustomed to being outside of our knowledge base, our knowledge castle. And so then when we're outside of that, and we're in perhaps a good learning situation, it feels wrong. It's like, no, this isn't right. I know things. You know, I'm a person. I know things. I have expertise. I have status, you know. This is not supposed to feel this way. Life isn't supposed to feel this way. I'm going to go back to my own domain of knowledge and status. So I think that one has to sort of constantly wrestle with that. What would it be? Entropy.
Everything falling apart.
Or that if you don't expose yourself to stress or discomfort of physical or intellectual type, you will atrophy. That's what I mean by entropy. You can't stand still. You're either going forward or back. And forward means, it does mean resistance, experiencing some sort of resistance, whether that's the resistance of the barbell or the resistance of the verb conjugation chart, whatever it is.
Yeah. And you mentioned Shinzen Young. Yeah, the body wants to be comfortable. The mind wants answers. And that's how the mind is comfortable, when it knows what's going on. And I've experienced this kind of, I think at one point I'm like, I think I have an addiction to knowledge or something. Like I have an addiction to knowing. Like I'm always reading stuff. And I think several years ago during an ayahuasca journey, it was literally like the message for me was just like learning to let go of trying to make sense of things, because it literally plummeted me into this kind of space of where nothing made sense. It was it was like a madhouse, chaotic, like sounds, vibrations, weird things. Nothing made sense. Everything was disorienting for like 4 hours. And it was just like, it just tapped me out. It was, my mind kept wanting to be in that comfortable place of knowing and understanding. And here I was like in pure chaos. So I definitely resonate with that part of like wanting comfort in knowing and in being in that kind of uncertainty. And I'm actually curious if you've ever used psychedelics, and if you have they had a significant impact on your spiritual growth or your meditation practice? Because I don't think I've ever heard you speak about that.
Yeah. Well, sadly, they're illegal here in the UK. Actually, some years ago, and I may be remembering this correctly or incorrectly, but I think this is right. They passed a law because you know what happens in these sorts of laws. You can ban a substance, but let's say LSD, and then a chemist will just add another molecule to the LSD, which is an inert molecule, and then you can take this variation, and it's basically the same as taking LSD because this other molecule doesn't do anything. But it's not LSD, so you can't ban it. It's not illegal. until they catch up with the variations and this sort of thing. So what they did in the UK to get ahead of this is they said, okay, we're going to ban all psychoactive substances. I think this happened about 2016. I could be wrong. That's in my mind for some reason, because I remember finding this story very funny. And what they then realized was that included all foods, coffee, everything has, technically speaking, consciousness altering, mood altering, some sort of perspective, right? And so then they had to rewrite the law somehow, and it was delayed by 2 or 3 months to exclude things like coffee and I guess cigarettes and chocolate and stuff like that. It's very funny. So yeah, it's not something that's and it's not like the States where I think things are becoming more and more legalized there, right? Marijuana is legal in a lot of places, and now I hear even Colorado, they made psilocybin, wasn't it? So it's legal for certain things in certain contexts.
And so Portland also, I think. Yeah, I can just imagine you though being somewhere in Scotland and just like peeling, plucking the mushrooms off the ground and just eating them. I could see you doing that. Yeah,
of course, people do that. I've never done that myself. No, I've never gone mushroom hunting. It is a cool image, though. I agree. Something Tolkien-esque about that. I'm not suggesting he was into that, but I can imagine. If I was to do that, I'd definitely dress up kind of Gandalf style.
I also don't take you to be like a hyper law-abiding citizen. I kind of feel like you're like a rebel, so I'm kind of surprised that was your answer. It's like, oh, they're illegal here, so I can't get any or I can't use them or something like that.
Yeah, am I a rebel? I'm not sure if I'm a rebel. I'm not necessarily a rebel against the law.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. No. I wouldn't say I'm pretty law abiding actually as far as these things go.
Yeah.
The frontiers I'm interested in are not necessarily I try to keep my nose clean when it comes to the law.
Yeah, I got you. You have extensive experience training in somatic practices such as qigong and yoga. I'm curious, is there a specific practice, routine, program that you found was most effective in either healing something physical in your body or opening up your energy flow?
Perhaps I'll add one thing to what I said previously, which is, I think it came to my mind moments after I'd stopped talking, which is that, I mostly want to be sort of left alone, if you know what I mean, to sort of get on with the things that I'm interested in doing. And I think that's one of the reasons why I avoid breaking the law if I can possibly help it, because it's a good way of, it's not conducive with being left alone, I think. Yeah. But anyway, what are the... But I do admire the psychonauts. I do admire them. But anyway, what are the things that have opened up my body? Gosh. Actually, yeah, I've done a lot of those things. But one thing that not a lot of people know really a lot about is something called Grinberg Method. Grinberg. It's a method invented by a guy called Avi Grinberg.
Yeah, I've seen that, but please speak more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that to be quite profound. And it's not something you do to yourself. You have it done to you by a Grinberg practitioner. And it's specialized in all kinds of things, working with trauma, yes, but also working with pain, physical pain that's come about through, say, surgery, chronic pain that's come from surgery or other kind of injuries. In specific, dealing with one's relationship to pain. Avi Grinberg was a Zen guy. He was a massage therapist and a Zen guy. And so there's a lot of this sort of interdisciplinary ideas that go into this Grinberg. But he found that he was working on people, working on their bodies, massaging them and, putting them back together and so on. But then they kept coming back. The pain kept coming back. He couldn't fix it in any kind of, and he found this to be rather unsatisfactory. So he came up with, he started exploring this problem. And so the sorts of things they do in Grinberg is you face your relationship to pain, the way in which one holds on to pain, the way in which one is frozen into certain coping responses to pain or discomfort. So there are many different ways you can cope with challenges or threats or difficult things, pains, etc. And each of these coping mechanisms is perhaps quite reasonable and good, but we can sometimes get stuck into one particular way of relating to the pain. So for instance, one way of getting stuck, one might get stuck into a kind of endurance mode, turtling down and just enduring it, waiting it out. Actually, that's a great strategy. But if it's your only strategy, or it's your default strategy, or you're somehow stuck in that posture, that way of being, because perhaps it was successful at one point, or you just don't know any other way, then it can sometimes be a contributing part of the problem. So one of the things they do in Grinberg, and it's mostly to do with where you work with the body work and breathing and so on, they show you how to respond differently, how to take different responses.
I've seen some of the videos of Avi Grinberg doing the stuff. I don't remember exactly what it was. It might have been like somebody holding like a wall sit for a long time, or like holding some kind of painful. So I remember it had to do something with pain. But that's definitely something interesting that I would like to look into more. You've also created something called the Movement Koan Method. Can you speak on this, and in particular, maybe the cutting edge neuroplasticity techniques? That's very fascinating to me. Yeah.
Well, that Movement Koan Method, I've got 2 DVD downloads on my site, guruviking.com, about that. And the 2 words are movement and koan, right? So it's joint nourishing movement and of various kinds, and also kind of movements like cross-body movement, one arm forward, one arm back, that sort of thing, and using movement patterns that cross the body in interesting ways. That's part of the neuroplasticity aspect that you were pointing to. And the koan part, a koan is a Zen training technique. Some people call it kind of a Zen riddle. That's one way of looking at it. Maybe, I think, a low resolution way of describing it. But your Zen teacher might ask you something like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Or does a dog have Buddha nature? Or this sort of thing. And it's actually a meditation technique. You contemplate this koan, this riddle, or this question, or this problem that the teacher gives you. And then you return to the teacher, and you're supposed to give your response. And this is sort of a method of training that's done in Zen. It's not entirely an intellectual exercise, actually. I think one is supposed to go beyond the intellect in a way with these koans. But anyway, so it's a means of inquiry, lens of inquiry. So in terms of a movement koan, we use the body as the means or the venue of inquiry, setting up, if you want, riddles in the body, or asking questions with the body, and using that as a venue of exploration. I'll give you an example. One of the things we do is stand on one leg and swing the other leg kind of casually back and forth. And then I'll ask the person to, as much as they can while still remaining standing, relax the base leg. How relaxed can you make the base leg while still remaining standing? Minimum necessary muscular activation. Minimum possible muscular activation, you'd be totally relaxed on the ground. But minimum necessary muscular activation, necessary for what? For standing. And then what happens is you start to question those layers of tension that you're using. And then a few things become apparent. So that's, if you want, setting the stage, right? That's kind of the koan, if you like. And then people notice all sorts of interesting things. I'll give you 2 examples. One of them is when you start to relax that base leg that you're balancing on and swinging the other leg forward and back, the feeling of the muscular fatigue spikes. Somehow relaxing that base leg, you feel more of the muscular fatigue. And that's because we don't only use tension for the action. It looks like it's for. We also use it as an anesthesia, as a bracing against feeling. And so when we relax that layer of tension or bracing, of course, you feel what's underneath. Of course, using muscular tension to brace against feeling, the product of muscular tension, which is muscular fatigue, is not a great long-term strategy. But nonetheless, we do it. Another thing we might discover is that another use of tension that's not just standing is a kind of anticipation of the future, a bracing in anticipation of future balancing needs. How long are you going to be standing? We're standing on one leg over a period of time, it seems. So we have to, in a certain sense, the body can sometimes brace in anticipation of future balance needs. But actually, you can't balance really over a period of time. And of course, on one level you can, but on another level you can't. All you can do is balance now. And if you're balanced now, then you'll be balanced now. If you try to balance across time, you will be unable to do it. You'll be balancing now, and you'll also be doing something else, some sort of bracing or anticipation or imagining or etc. etc. So this is so both of those things I've said, tension is anesthesia, which can sometimes contribute actually to what's underneath, and this idea of bracing into the future balancing needs are ripe, if you want, channels of insight. It's true also meditation, we notice that, right? That a lot of the discomfort and distress we might experience meditating, when you're meditating, is to do with imagining a future that hasn't happened yet, or thinking ahead into the future, or perhaps thinking back into the past. So there's a kind of sense in which actually you're fine as you are right there. You're actually fine. But of course, what's going to happen in half an hour? What's going to happen in 2 weeks? What's going to happen in 2 years? Well, who knows? But all kinds of things might happen. And there's a place for looking ahead. There's a place for planning and preparing and all that sort of thing. But there's also a way in which we can confuse or lose sight of what's actually happening now and end up torturing ourselves in a way by looking ahead into the future in a helpful way. This was driven home to me I was very ill at one point, and I was in the hospital, and they gave me all sorts of drugs to try to help me. And it was a physical illness that I had, and they didn't know what it was, so they were throwing everything at me to try to save my life. I was quite close to death, and in a lot of discomfort. And all this cocktail of drugs sort of soaked into me somehow and produced this tremendous despair. I had this terrible sense of despair, and it was sort of soaking every part of my mind. I noticed it was when they injected a particular anti-nausea drug, which they had to give me to try and keep down all the other things they were giving me. There was a terrible despair that would come for the next sort of 4 to 6 hours. Anyway, it even infected those parts of my mind that reframe a challenging situation. So I don't know if you do this, but sometimes if I'm going through a difficult time or a difficult situation, I'll say to myself, well, it could be worse. And I'll try to think of something that could be worse than what I'm having. And, there are a lot of things often that I can imagine in that situation. I think of other places in the world, other people, other situations that are worse. And I think, gosh, I guess it's not so bad after all. Try to reframe, right? Even my reframing apparatus in my mind seemed to be soaked with despair. I couldn't get it off the ground. So it became very intense. And bear in mind, I was also quite close to dying as well, which tends to heighten things a bit. And it was unbearable. And I recognized that, or rather what happened then, there was this sort of squeezing I was squeezed from both sides. When I thought about the past, about how things were much better in the past when I wasn't in hospital almost dying, it became unbearable. I couldn't even add that extra load of yearning for the past. And when I thought of the future and wondering, will I ever get better? What's going to happen next? Because there was a great deal of confusion at that time. They didn't know what was going on. Looking ahead, what's going to happen to me? Will I ever be well again? Oh, this sort of those two activities were adding so much strain to the situation that I couldn't sustain them. And because of the intensity of the situation, I was kind of squeezed by nature into the present moment, if you like. And this mantra came in my mind, a kind of spontaneous, repetitive phrase came in my mind, which is, now I'm okay. Now I'm okay. Which wasn't a comforting thing, like saying, you're okay, you're okay. It was a recognition that actually at that moment I was fine. I couldn't stand it another second. I couldn't stand it for 5 more seconds. I couldn't bear it for 5 more seconds, but I could bear it now. I could bear it now, right now, right now, right now is fine. And I recognized I was actually completely fine in all of that discomfort. Right now I was fine, right now I was fine. Of course, in that right now, went on for a long time. But the point is, as I pointed out with the balancing exercise, that all I could handle was right then and there. And there was this sense of kind of unification of my observer with the observed, a little bit like an oscilloscope with two waves of an oscilloscope coming into a kind of consonance with each other. And there was a sort of a subject-object kind of merging that occurred at that time, which took away all the suffering. I was sort of squeezed into it, It's a little bit like I watched your video about your 5-MeO DMT, your transformative experiences you had with that. And, it reminds me a bit of that, because I suppose your 5-MeO DMT experience, once you'd taken that, it was nature in charge, right? You were squeezed by nature into this transformative experience that you had. Well, this was a bit similar, except it wasn't a psychedelic. It was sort of being very, very close to death and so on. So I had a lot of strange experiences around that time, because I was close to death for quite some time and had a lot of very, very strange experiences. That's one of them. It's sort of relevant to Movement Koan Method. So we look at different things in the body, playful, easy, joint nourishing, body nourishing movements with a twist. And that twist is this investigative or questioning aspect. And I find that if you can learn something in the body, you have an experience in the body, it very easily percolates up to the mind. Sometimes it's hard. You can learn a concept, an idea, but without an embodied sense of having experienced it, then it can be hard to apply or to recognize, or one's still interpreting that lesson or context or concept through one's current position. But a learning of the body has a different kind of effect. So when we learn in the body like that, the things we learn, the principles we learn, it seem to bubble from the bottom up. And then you can recognize all these different applications of things you learn. So that's the sort of thing that Movement Koan is about.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked that question, because so much came out. And, there's a lot of just the fascinating about the actual practice, and, how actually releasing tension, you start to feel more fatigue. Like, that's very counterintuitive. I wouldn't have expected that. So that's a very interesting element. And I was just kind of trying to feel into what you were saying with the practice. And I can see how, like, there's all this sensitivity in the body and all these things that happen when we do certain physical activities. And there's all this tension that obscures us from that sensitivity or protects us from feeling our bodies and feeling life more. And it's the same thing. And then you related it back to meditation, which is also interesting. And then I was really kind of struck by, your story about being close to death. And I guess I'm curious how long ago this was, because this seems like it's a pivotal event. And then it also seems like maybe that was kind of an awakening experience. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying, with kind of just the subject and the object merging.
It was a moment of learning, I would say. I wouldn't say it wasn't a moment of awakening. It was a moment of learning quite deeply. And because it was quite protracted, it went on for some time. It was a learning that had some time to, bed in, I suppose. But actually, the more profound experience at that time happened before that. So I would, seeing as you're asking about pivotal moments, I suppose, should I tell the story?
Sure, please do.
Well, to cut a long story short, I had internal bleeding that due to something I was born with, a genetic, I won't say defect, because it's 2022. Can I say variation? A special defect. I was special, Artem. But anyway, the specialness that I had, my particular specialness, was... so I'm cutting now to the chase. There's a longer way I could tell the story when I didn't know what it was and all this sort of thing, but never mind that. So I hadn't had any problems with this up until this moment. My intestines had a cul-de-sac of stomach tissue. I've been born that way. So sort of normal intestine, then sort of cul-de-sac of stomach tissue. And of course, stomach tissue should be in the stomach. It shouldn't be this little cul-de-sac coming off, or a little pouch, I suppose, coming off of your intestine. So anyway, Usually they catch it when you're a kid. It's called Meckel's diverticulum. And so one day, a little over 10 years ago, to answer your other question, it switched on as stomach tissue and started to produce stomach acid. And that stomach acid, of course, in the stomach is okay, but in the intestines, it's not so good. So it created an internal bleeding in my intestines, right? No pain, though. No pain from that. And I started to, should we say, void massive amounts of blood, right? But black tar, the actual pouch was quite high up in my intestinal tract. So when you bleed internally, from low down, it looks like blood, it's red. But when you bleed from higher up in your gastrointestinal tract, it comes out kind of black. And it's a substance called melena. And because it's been somewhat partially digested on the way down, right? Anyway, and it smells really bad. I'll tell you that. Anyway, so all this started coming out. I went to the doctor and they said, oh, did you eat a lot of licorice and all this sort of thing? So I went through this whole thing. So it took me about 10 days to get, or 7 or 8 days to get to the hospital, because this doctor was kind of telling me I was fine. All this while, what happens when you lose a lot of blood is you lose also red blood cells. And red blood cells are what transport the oxygen from your lungs, I guess, to the cells, right, of your body. So if you lose a lot of blood like that, you can't get the oxygen that you're breathing in to oxygenate the body. It can't get transported in that way. So I started suffocating, but on a sort of cellular level. I could still breathe, but it wasn't, oxygenating the body very well. So I became very weak, and there was still bleeding going on, and I became very weak. And, my friends had to carry me up the stairs of my apartment, this sort of thing. It was really interesting. Towards the end, I said to myself, okay, if I can get to the toilet, go to the bathroom and come back again, I was in my bed then, which was about, I don't know, it's like 15, 20 feet maybe. Then I will wait till the morning to go to the hospital because I was getting worse and worse. If I can't, then I'll go to the hospital, like the ER. And so I tried to lift my head up off the pillow and it fell back. It got to the point then where I couldn't even get out of bed. Previously, in order to get to the bathroom, I had to take 1 or 2 stops. But now, I couldn't even lift my head. So my brother, who I lived with at the time, we shared an apartment in London, called the ambulance. And they came. Took me to the ER. We call it the A&E, but it's the ER. And I was rushed in there. And I rushed in, the nurse looked at me, and suddenly everything came alive, and I was taken to there's different degrees of ER, right, depending on how badly messed up you are. I went to the serious one, right? And I went to the one where suddenly, it's great, actually, you get to go to the front of the queue, and everyone is, looking after you and trying to, but anyway, it's not good because the reason you're there is very bad, of course. So I was there, and they said, we're going to have to do an emergency blood transfusion, all this sort of stuff. And they said, so if you should have about 14 to 16, I think, red blood cell count as an adult male. People start dying around 7. I was down to 4. My heart was maxed out, max BPM. There's apparently a BPM your heart can go that's sort of its max. My heart was at the max, and it had been at the max for a while. I was very fit at that time, and younger, and more handsome, sadly. But anyway, never mind. That's age for you. And so I'd managed to survive. And up till then, my brother left the booth, the little booth you're in the ER, to call my parents to tell them what was happening. And the doctor said, don't go. He's probably not going to make it. So I heard that. And when I heard that, it was like someone pulled the plug on one of those old TVs, those old cathode ray tube TVs where you turn them off and they go boo to a white dot. And everything went to switched off. And then I saw before me kind of like someone's riffling a deck of cards, my life go by. And I had this sense of completeness and perfection. Not that I'd done everything perfectly right, but that everything had to have gone the way it went. So that was the sense of the feeling, right? So this sort of it was literally like someone was riffling from one side to the other. My life, right there. And then I saw a kind of Zen painting. You know, those Zen things where they do sort of calligraphy in a very kind of Zen way, right? The way they do it is sort of expression of their Zenness, I suppose. I saw a Zen brush just paint a diagonal line down, and it had that sense of spontaneity as well. So there's a sense of perfection, but then also a sense of spontaneity. Anyway, I could go into that, but that's enough for now, I think. And then I felt my body again, and I experienced my body, and I experienced the body's will to live. I experienced that the body had the sense that the body was a sort of series of interconnecting patterns, in a sense, that had its own momentum, and that when that momentum was over, the patterns would sort of, you know, the strands of the rope of the body's being would sort of dissipate, lose their coherence, dissipate into, you know, as elements do when you die, I guess, you know, into other things. And I recognized then as that's the will to live. The body's going to keep living until it can't live anymore. It's like a candle. A candle, when you light a candle, it burns all the way down. It doesn't look at the bottom and go, almost out of wax, I better burn more slowly. When you burn a candle, it goes all the way down, unless you blow it out, all the way down, all the way. Full commitment, you could say. So I experienced that. And then my mind came back on, or my sort of personality, if you like, came back on. And I experienced also the mind, this momentum as well. And then my mind was going to keep going until it ran out of momentum, yeah. And it would also sort of unravel at the end there. And then I recognized that I was going to, so I kind of let the mind and body. Well, I think a lot of people give up when they're faced with death or something like that, because in a sense, we're afraid to really try to survive in case we can't. There's almost a sense in which we can't quite face the situation. And it's possible, because to face the situation means to acknowledge its possible outcome, which, as you pointed out earlier, is death, right? So in a way, in refusing, we won't even rise to it, you know? Anyway, so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to let my mind and my body. I mean, I didn't think this exactly, but this was, I'm trying to put words on the position that I arrived at, which was that I'm going to let, you know, my mind and my body are just going to keep doing what they do until they die. And if they die, that's fine. Didn't seem like it was a big problem. But at the same time, I wasn't going to die a moment earlier than I had run out of momentum in those structures. I wasn't going to die a moment earlier than there was nothing left to wring out of it. That was the sense. That's what the will to live. That's what the will to live feels like. When it's not inhibited by an unwillingness to face death, basically the possibility of death. You know. Anyway. So then suddenly my eyes came back online. You know, I could see suddenly what was going on. I looked around and looked at the curtains, you know, there's in the floor and so on they have. And the curtains on the floor were me. In the sense that the thing that, you know, that was watching the mind and watching the body and all this sort of thing, it's not exactly quite right, but the division between inside, outside, etc., was gone. So it was like it was me. The floors were me, or I was, or at least they weren't not me. Something like this. Perhaps hard to. Maybe I'm describing it poorly. So that was quite profound, and really rather life-changing, I would say. Anyway, and then it was in the aftermath of that when they started to give me these transfusions. They didn't know why I was losing a lot of blood. They thought all these kind of things it might be. Anyway. Ended up being this, as I said, this stomach tissue cul-de-sac, which some months later they were able to simply vivisect, to cut out. And then it doesn't grow back or anything like that. So I was very lucky that there were a long list of really nasty things that it could have been. And that's why they're throwing everything in the book at me. But then it ended up being this thing at the bottom, which is really, really rare, and it's definitely not that. But it ended up being that. Yeah, so then they were so luckily, some months later, they simply cut that bit out, and it hasn't bothered me since. But anyway, it was in the aftermath of that, in the days and week after that I was in the hospital, still quite close to dying in those next hours, that this other experience that I mentioned to you about being squeezed from out of the past and out of the future into something, was happening. So that's we've sort of reversed our way into that story.
yeah, inside out. Thank you so much for sharing that. That like shook me up, and it really sounds like that was a near-death experience. And you say that it's a learning, an experience of learning, not an experience of awakening. You did say though that that somehow changed your life. So I'm curious, how did it change your life going forward?
Well,
if you could put it in words, even.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, of course, there are some things one can't say, but I can't put into words. But I found it oriented. It seemed like more or less everything. So coming out of that experience, I noticed that everything was upside down and different. So I reacted to things differently. Things that bothered me before didn't bother me anymore. Other things I was more sensitive to. So it seemed like all the pieces had been moved around somehow inside. And this sort of feeling, this sort of seeing through a certain fixed view that I hadn't even recognized I had, of separateness, perhaps, as they say, right? Meant that everything had to be, in a way, relearned. So I had to discover who I was, I suppose, or rather acclimatize. That's a better way of saying it. I had to acclimatize to that new unmooring from that fixed view. So I found that was the case. And so I was also very, very drawn. So previously I'd enjoyed reading about the things I like to read about changed, actually. I was perhaps more interested in reading about, achieving this or achieving that. Suddenly that changed. And I was resonating with other things. And so I spent the next couple of years, actually. I lived in a part of London near Greenwich Park, right next to Greenwich Park, which is a lovely park in London. And I went there and I found this oak tree. And I would sit under that oak tree. So for some months, I sort of had to recover a bit. And then I had the surgery later on and I had to recover from that. So I was kind of not, should we say, my physical, peak in terms of, I had to do a lot of recovery, essentially. So I would go to the park. I was still able to work, but I would go to the park and sit. I still, worked for myself at those days, so I had a lot of time. I go to the park and I just meditate under this big oak tree. And I'd sit there, and it was very strange. The sorts of strange experiences I would have there. I was drawn to meditation there, and I'd have a lot of strange kind of meditation style experiences there. I'd spend a lot of time sitting there. So I'd sit for about an hour, and then I'd do, say, 20 minutes of yoga. And then I'd sit for an hour and do 20 minutes of yoga, and sit for an hour, and then do, get up and then go and get a coffee at the Pavilion Cafe in the top of the park. And then I'd come back down again, and I'd just sit there for hour upon hour upon hour upon hour, day after day after day after day. And if it was raining, which it often does in the UK, I had this green poncho, which I used to wear. I'd sit there in the rain as well. Not getting wet, of course, because with the poncho I didn't get wet. And I just was drawn there, it seemed, So I had this long period of meditating almost all the time that I wasn't doing anything else, which was a lot of the time. In those days, my primary occupation was as a musician. So, musicians have strange hours, and how it is with musicians. You're on the gig, you're off the gig, etc. You often have the day free. Certainly, you have the day free. So I would spend a lot of the day in there, so in the park. That's one of the ways it changed things. It changed my life a lot. It made things a lot more fluid and a lot less tangible in a way, a lot less fixed. Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but now it sounds like a trip report to me. It sounds like, a trip report. And isn't it the joke that the only people who are interested in trip reports are the people telling the trip report? Is that the case?
I mean, a lot of what you're sharing is kind of reminds me a little bit about the 5-MeO for me. There was definitely similar type of shifts like that. I am curious, though, you did say that you didn't consider this an experience of awakening, but it kind of seems like it was to me. So I'm just wondering if you could say more on that, why you don't consider it an awakening or yeah, because even like the separateness thing, like, feeling less separate, it seems like it's at least moving in that direction.
Yeah. Well, Artem, on my podcast, I interview a lot of people, right? And a lot of people claim to various degrees of enlightenment and attainment on the podcast, right? All I can say is the more I hear people talk about their attainments and enlightenments, the clearer it becomes to me that whatever it is they're up to is not what I'm up to. It's not my experience. They have these, they describe it, how they got there, all these sort of things. Yeah, I don't map it onto that at all. So, when I think of awakenings and so on, I think of the sorts of things people tell me about in the podcast. And I'm very interested in that. I love to hear people's stories of awake. That's why I watched your 5-MeO DMT video. It's like the first or second video you did, right? Back at the very beginning of your channel.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated to hear that, as well as the sort of, it was a tremendous experience, but then also something of a crisis afterwards, it seems, too, or a lot of adjustments to be done.
Yeah, for a while. I think it only recently kind of stabilized for me. It was just too much, like, I don't know where to put this or how to integrate this or what do I do with this kind of thing. Yeah, so it's coming back.
Well, how did you put it back together again? What did you find, or did you put it back together again?
Yeah, I don't know if I did anything or if it just kind of works itself out. I just think like with psychedelics, there's not, I think we're going to find as we go deeper and deeper into this and learn more and more that there needs to be a better way of integrating these kind of things and just these kind of experiences. So there was like stages of it, and probably one stage that kind of helped was Daniel Ingram's book, like running across the Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and just like looking at his the map of insights and all of that, and just now that I look back on it, it's kind of less helpful. But I think at that point it kind of grounded me, oriented me, and like the whole Dark Night part thing. I'm like, all right, this makes sense. Like I had this like AMP experience. That's what he calls it. Like that's how I mapped it at the time. And then I just slowly was starting to piece it back together. Like, okay, this is what happened to me. And like, I think a big part of it was just learning. I don't know. It's just like, to me, it's like, that's the taste of the ultimate. That's the taste of the ultimate. That's a complete non-dual experience, complete ego dissolving experience, oneness with everything. And then you come into relative reality where there's this sense of separation. And like the big insight for me, I did this 3 times, and the big insight was coming out of it was like, oh, the ego is an illusion, and this whole sense of, similar to what you said, like the achieving, like having to achieve, or like having to step on other people's toes, having to pull people off the ladder to get somewhere. Somehow that was very illusory, and it was just like an appearance. Like it appears like this is what we need to do. And the message that it kind of gave me was like, oh, there's all you need to do is just love. You need to live in love and fully embody love. Like at the end of the day, that's all it's really about. And even coming out of the experience, for me, all 3 times, it was kind of a crying and a laughing at the same time. The crying was, there's tears of joy, but there's also some kind of grief of like, oh my God, why are we living like this? Or why have I been living like this, kind of stuck in this illusion? And then there's the relief of like, oh, it's so simple. It's so simple. It's just about love. But then when you come out, you come out of it and you get this, at that moment, maybe I thought I was enlightened or whatever. I got it. I got, this whole thing of life. I got the answer. And then you come back and like, oh, I don't still got the answer because I still have the reactivity. I still have the relative things that I have to deal with. And I don't know how to live from that place of love, to live from that place of non-reactivity and that place of non-separation. I don't know how to do that. And I think I just been learning how to more skillfully integrate that and just become more embodied and more not trying to, oh, I need to get away from relative reality. I need to get away from this illusion. I need to, get away from samsara. I need to get back to that place. And kind of saying, no, this is it right now. I'm here now. How can I live within the framing of the ego and within this interface and see that, yeah, there's something illusory there and not be so identified with it, but also still be able to participate in this human experience. And I think it's just been a learning experience for me, just gradually unpacking. But definitely, I think for like the first 3 years, it was just a lot of ups and downs. I'm like, I don't know how to relate to other people. I don't know where to put this. I don't know what I do. So that's how it kind of was for me.
Yeah. At that time, I mentioned it to a couple of my teachers and one or two friends who were, if you want, in a position to comment on it, you could say. And then I had the strong sense of just forgetting it. And so after 2-3 years, I mentioned it to a couple of teachers. And then, so I didn't talk about this at all at the time, really. And then I mentioned it to a couple of teachers and a couple of friends. And then that happened in the course of a span of months. And then I just stopped thinking about it and stopped talking about it. I just dropped it, let it go. And I remember going into a winter thinking, that's it. This, this is not going to become a story. Like then sometimes there's like the come to Jesus story, or sometimes the non-dual teachers, they've always got to have their, epiphany moment that they constantly mine for, clout and so on. I thought, it just seems so silly. So I just dropped it and didn't talk about it for a long time. And then only later, much later on now, I occasionally will mention it in a context like this because it's an interesting story, I suppose. But I would describe it in a sense as a recontextualizing of the sense of self. It was a recontextualizing of the sense of self. That was how I described it at the time. Or when I mentioned it to a couple of my teachers 2 or 3 years later, I described it as a recontextualizing of the sense of self. So it's the self is still there. I'm still here. Evidently, here I am. But the context is rather different. This is sort of figure ground reversal. And, I think that's what I'm hearing in what you're saying too. Everything's the same but different. And how you have to do all the same things but differently, including experience oneself and be oneself actually. But there's such a different context that everything is requires an acclimatization. Yeah. Yeah, an acclimatization, I think, I prefer to integration, because acclimatization, integration has the sense of putting things back together again. And I'm not entirely sure that's necessarily possible or even desirable, maybe. But acclimatization, just getting used to it, learning to operate in the ambiguity of it seems to be something that is, as you say, kind of inevitable, right? Just time. I think time takes care of that. Yeah, time and practice. Meditation helps a great deal.
Yeah, I think that also helped me with a lot of the psychedelic experiences, like that just helped integrate them, and I think it also made them more powerful. In particular, the 5-MeO. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of what you're saying, just that maps back. Like when I had the Toad experience, like I couldn't stop talking about it for years, probably for like 2 years. That was my go-to story. Anybody I met, I'm going right at that. And then after a while, it just burned itself out. And, I saw it was like, that's a story. Somehow it became like a spiritual materialism. Even though the story was, and still it's the most profound experiences that I've had. And still, like I said, it's a story I'll still share and speak about. but there stopped being this compulsion and this, oh, I got to keep coming back to it. And I think that's part of like it, that kind of, I stopped thinking about it so much, stopped talking about it so much. And it was like, yeah, that was just an experience, even though there was something that seemed to illuminate and shift. Yeah, it's something about it. It was something about it was very significant, but then something about it was very ordinary. Like it was just another experience.
Yeah, exactly. I got to the point where I mentioned it, like I said, 2-3 years later, I said it to a couple of friends and a couple of, 2 friends and 2 teachers. And, because I just wanted to run it by some people that they were my teachers in that area of meditation and so on. And I just wanted to, just run it by them so I could drop it. It wasn't that I was talking about it a lot, because I didn't talk about it a lot, but nonetheless, it's like, should I be doing something? Is there something that I should do, or is with this, or is there some kind of thing I should do now, or can I just drop it, and just move on with my life, and that's why I needed to run it by them, and it was wonderful actually to do that. And one of those people was Shinzen Young, actually. Yeah. And so, I told him and another one of my teachers, Godfrey Devereaux, about it, and two of my close friends who were well informed about such things. And they gave me whatever feedback they gave me. And it was kind of really, okay, great. Now I just move on.
They gave you permission to drop it?
No, they didn't give me permission to do anything. But I felt that any obligation I might have to myself or to that experience or anything like that was relieved at that point, because you don't want to throw away significant and special things. But on the other hand, as you point out, there's this strange sense in which it's significant and special on the one hand, but on the other hand, quite normal and quite ordinary, especially when, in my case, I didn't do anything. It wasn't like I was meditating high in the Himalayas and then suddenly something happened. It wasn't like that. Like so many of my guests, meditate and do great spiritual seeking, and then they reach a goal that they've been seeking to attain. I wasn't seeking to attain anything. I just happened to, void massive amounts of blood and almost die. So, it wasn't in that context of, and the same with, you, to it seems you didn't really know what you were getting into from, at least that's what it said in I got the sense from your video, you didn't really know what you're getting into. And so now you got into it. So, one doesn't want to be careless with life. But on the other hand, I think you expressed it very well, actually. It's so ordinary as well. And there's something wonderfully liberating, actually, in just letting it go. Letting it go doesn't mean going back to this, going back to the way it was. Doesn't mean that. It just means don't fixate one's identity on it. Don't make it an essential biographical point that one always relates from constantly. Because then all you've done is changed one fixed position for another fixed position. You've gone from one prison cell to another prison cell, except this new prison cell has prayer flags and incense.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why, I don't like this as an awakening. No, there's a learning experience, yeah. But I think awakening is too final for me. It's too fixed for me. I don't like the connotations that go along with it. But in another sense, every learning is an awakening, isn't it, to something new? So in that sense, everything one learns is an awakening of kind, right? So, but that's not the sense that you meant. I understand. I don't like the to use that word in description of that kind of an experience. It implies something which, especially having listened to many of my guests, it implies something which it's not something I can claim.
Yeah. Daniel speaks about the models of awakening, and it seems like everybody has their own model. And two ways of talking about it is one is like there's a certain point you have to get to. Like once you've gotten to that point and once you've crossed over that threshold, for some people that's stream entry, whatever, you're awakened. But then there's another way of looking at it, which is more of a spectrum. It's like are you ever fully awakened, fully liberated? Are you fully extinguished, fully done, fully developed? And there's different ways of looking at it. And some would say that, there are clear markers, like you have to, there's certain things that have to be transcended, and there's certain markers that kind of identify that, yes, you are in fact awakened, or yes, you are this path or that path or third path, fourth path. And there's something appealing about the whole, crossing a threshold and like climbing the top of a mountain. And now I'm there. I think in recent years, I kind of started looking at it more of as a spectrum thing. Like, it's just, we're all kind of moving towards it somehow, and somebody's further down there and realize things on a deeper level. But it seems like there is, I don't know. Everybody has a different definition, and that's, I think, where we run into all these problems. And all the people you've hosted, you get all of them in a room, and they'll probably disagree on a lot of things regarding awakening.
Yeah. You're right. It's one of the problems with that word, isn't it? That 100 people mean 100 different things with that same word, And there's even debate and argument within traditions about that. There's no such thing really as a Buddhist awakening, for example, versus a Hindu one or a Christian one. Not really. There is as much diversity within the traditions as there is between them, it seems.
Yeah. And maybe this is a good part to kind of dive a little deeper into your podcast. And we already started talking about awakening, which is also something I wanted to talk about. I love your podcast. I think it's one of the best. I wanted to say, I'm grateful that your kind of condition and all that stabilized, because if it hadn't, we wouldn't have had this great podcast and all these great interviews that you've done over the last several years. And it is, I think, one of the best meditation spirituality podcasts. It's one of the podcasts that I've been listening to a lot, especially recently. Maybe the only other podcast in that space that I think is of that quality is perhaps Michael Taft's Deconstructing Yourself, which is another fascinating one. But I'd like to start by just kind of inquiring into the title Guru Viking. I kind of have a story of what that means, but I just want to see if how you came up with that or what that means for you.
That's funny, yeah. Well, thank you very much for those kind words, yeah. I interviewed Michael Taft recently a couple of times. Amazing, both of those episodes. And I'm actually doing his meditation course in a week or two, yeah. He's also Shinzen Young student. Did you know that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, and also Michael Taft, as you probably know, used to work at Sounds True, which is
for sure,
spiritual kind of new age religious publisher, and he edited the audio. He did the audio editing, I believe, on Shinzen's breakout hit Science of Enlightenment CD set, which I listened to a lot in those days, and also helped him edit a great deal of the book version of that, The Science of Enlightenment, which came out only in recent years, actually. So
great book.
Almost, I think, 10, 15 years later than the CD set. So he goes a long way back with Shinzen. Yeah, it was really interesting to interview him. I sat beside him, actually, at a couple of retreats of Shinzen's before, but because it's the silent retreat, you don't speak, so...
You're Michael Taft, but I can't say anything to you.
Well, what I mean is, there's a lot of times at these Shinzen retreats, you meet people kind of, in the sense that I, meditated with some of them for many years, but never talked to them. You have a little bit of chatting at the end, but you can't get around everybody. So there's a lot of people on a kind of site basis. Anyway, yeah, he's a very interesting guy, Michael Taft. Guru Viking, well, you've got to have a name for these things. My name's Steve, right? And so I'm not just going to say Steve, right? It's Steve, the Steve podcast.
The Steve James Show.
Yeah, the Steve James Show. It could be about anything, right? It could be about knitting or, claymore swinging or who knows what, right? I mean, the sword, not the mine. So you've got to have a name. And so Guru Viking, because it's about meditation, spirituality, and contemplative stuff, talking to practitioners, teachers, scholars, etc., right? And I'm super interested in all that kind of thing too. So my website's Guru Viking. So that's that part, the interest in spiritual things. And then the Viking part is, of course, I grew up on this little island called Shetland, which is Viking place. And I have a big red beard and I live on a boat. This is a boat, by the way, in case people are wondering. It's not a shed or a bunker, although I would love to live in a bunker. I would love to have my very own bunker. That would be very cool. But anyway, I live on this canal boat So I live on a boat. This is kind of like a Viking. There's some other things that are kind of Viking as well. So that's what it comes down to. So guru, Viking. I also like, it's got a bit of a humor to it, a bit of tongue in cheek. I'm not really a guru, right? I'm not really a guru, and I'm not really a Viking, right? Obviously, we know that Vikings, as the scholars will tell us, Viking is a job description. You know, you go Viking, right? You're not a Viking, but okay. So I know all that. So it's kind of a humorous, slightly tongue in cheek, maybe Monty Python kind of slightly British humor way about it. So it's got a bit of humor in it as well, which is part of my personality. It's not funny. It's not a spoof, what we're doing on the podcast. It's not a spoof, but there's a little bit of playfulness in the title. So that's how that came to be, Guru Viking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of have a similar story, but like my story is like, oh, you're this Viking guy and you hunt down gurus. Like you go all around the world looking for gurus, the Guru Viking.
Oh, I like that. That's better. That's a better story. I like that story. Yeah, but I hunt them down and make them come on my podcast.
Yeah, tell me all your secrets to awakening. Share tell everybody how to do it. Yeah, I like that. That's great. Like that. Yeah, so your podcast has at this point well over 160 episodes, most of which you've recorded in the last 3 years. That's at least one podcast per week. Consistency and commitment, that's very impressive. And you also interview some of the most fascinating spiritual teachers and practitioners. Many of them I've never heard of until they were on your podcast. So I'm very curious about your process for creating the show. How do you find these interesting and esoteric guests, and how do you prepare for them? Just kind of, if you could share a little bit more. That's kind of a selfish question that I have, given that I have my own podcast.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you again for such kind words about it. Yeah. Well, I started off interviewing people I knew, some friends, or acquaintances, people like Lauren Roche and etc. If you look back to who was my first episode, for example, someone that I'd met and knew and was friends with, I've been friends with for some time. So sometimes it's like that, or sometimes people email me and ask if they can be interviewed. That happens sometimes. Or a student will email and say, would you email my, guru, or my teacher or whatever, Or a viewer will email and say, I really like this person, not necessarily their guru or teacher or something, but I really like this person. I'd love to see you interview this person. So sometimes I get like suggestions over Instagram and email, which is always very interesting and very cool, actually. Sometimes other guests will recommend other guests. And plus, in my reading, I encounter all kinds of people reading and invite them too. But I invite, so I'm always delighted when people say yes, because often people say no, actually. You've probably encountered this too. I don't know if you've.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people say no. And of course, as time goes by, less people say no.
Yeah.
Because initially it's like, who is this guy, Guru Viking? Is he a guru, or is this? He seems a little bit, like weird and crazy. He's only got 3 episodes,
Yeah.
I'm far too important to appear on a podcast like that. So they don't do it. But over time that changes. But so that's how I do it. I just follow my interest, really, and also recommendations and suggestions that others give me. And not being afraid to ask the people that I really want to interview. And the worst that can happen is they say no.
Yeah.
The worst they can. Sometimes they say no kind of rude, but most of the time they say no really politely and nicely. And the rude ones are often to make the best stories.
Yeah, I got a couple of those.
Yeah. So, you never know what kind of day someone's had, I guess, when they write that email. But so anyway, my process is that when I've secured the guest, I will do a bit of research on them, of course, right? Often I'll have done that before, but not always as in depth. So I'll try to read what they've written and, watch any lectures they may have and just get to know them and get to know their body of work. But of course, I generally have a sense of why, not generally, I always have a sense of why I want to interview somebody first. And so I'll already have done some pre-reading, and I really find something about them really cool or interesting or fascinating or, controversial maybe. So I will get deeper into their work, and then I prepare my questions as jumping off points, really. It's good to have good questions as a jumping off point, but as you know, the conversations can go in some other direction, and it's not uncommon for me to have at least half or more of my questions just not used. So I prepare a lot more than I end up using, just in case, because some guests are really like myself, as you can tell, will just talk and talk and talk and talk and go off on all these really weird tangents. Right, that's what I'm doing. But other guests are more precise, and they will give you just the answer to the question you asked, and then nothing. And then you think, this is going to be quick. How many questions do I have? If they keep answering in such a precise way, then I'm going to be out of time. So, and also, of course, what the guests say will make more questions come. So sometimes they'll say something that gives me another question that I hadn't prepared. So that's more or less the process. Is that the sort of thing you were looking for?
Yeah, very similar to that. A lot of the guests that I interview, I read a lot of their books, and that usually is a lot of times I'll just read the books and I'll do a lot of work up front before even getting the guest. Yeah. Some people are guests that don't have books, like yourself. I just been following for a while, so it wasn't necessarily a book. It wasn't like meticulous note taking, and it was kind of easier to prepare for you just because I've seen so much of your podcast, and I think we just have a lot of similar interests. And then just kind of going on your website, I was able to find other interesting bits of information for you. And actually, I think for your interview, I got like a lot more questions than even for a lot of my other interviews that I've done, because there's so many pieces to your life. I feel like so many, and there's just so much that's interesting, because I guess we just have a lot of similarity with like the meditation and awakening. And that's why I think I've been watching there's a lot of podcasts, right? And I just, between creating my own podcast and everything else I have in my life, I don't really have time to watch too many of them. So your podcast has just been one of those that just given where I'm at is kind of interesting. And
that means a lot. Thank you, Artem. Yeah, there are so many similarities. You're right. And that became clear to me when I started watching some of your earlier videos where before you're interviewing people, you're talking more about your own experiences. I noticed that too. But I think you've said something which I think is really the key. Interesting, right? You've said that word, interesting. You were interested in, you're talking, about, I guess, me and certain things. You got interested in me. And I think that's what I do as well. I find myself very interested in my guests. I find them interesting. I think that's an important quality. So I really want to know about them and listen to what they say and respond with interest. And then it comes quite naturally. A lot of preparation, and then the interest, I think, it goes a long way. And that's a quality it seems you're sharing as well.
Yeah. So there's a couple other things. I mean, there's a bunch of other questions I have, but I guess you mentioned Shinzen Young a lot. And that's one of the questions I had is, how and when did you first come across Shinzen, and how has interacting with him impacted you? Anything else you could share on your relationship with him?
Wow, yeah. Well, I came across him before I met him. So I think I came across him probably on YouTube. Or
how long
maybe,
ago was this?
I don't know, 12 years ago, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible? How long's YouTube been going?
Yeah, it's been around.
Yeah. Or maybe, yeah, I don't quite recall, but I remember seeing him on YouTube and all that, and listening to the Science of Enlightenment series. Now, how I got hold of that, I don't know, but I don't think I bought it. So this is another thing. It may have been part of some bundle that came my way somehow or another. I think that's probably more likely the case, actually, that somehow or another it was part of some, zip file that I don't know how it got on my hard drive. But anyway, back in those days, early 20s and so on. So I came across it, yeah. And and then eventually I started going on retreats with him in person, and training with him, you could say, in person. Yeah, well, Shinzen's a very interesting teacher because he is really, certainly, my impression of him in those days, and he goes through many iterations and he changes and he has different emphases over the years. He's famous actually for kind of emphasizing different things in different parts of his own, I suppose, intellectual unfolding. Now he's doing neuroscience research at University of Arizona, for example, and he's been on my podcast many times, along with his collaborator, Dr. Jay Sanguinetti, and others, coming on there all the time. So, he's in that kind of phase. But I remember he's very hardcore about practice. He was very into long sitting, duration sitting, so strong determination sitting, he calls it, sitting for, 1 to 4 hours or perhaps longer. He was very interested in that as both a means of training as well as a yardstick of the effect of one's training. So that's something I took on board. He's got a tremendous, I could go on and on and on for another 2 hours about what I learned from Shinzen. So you'll have to forgive me for giving an incomplete, top of the mind summary. Another thing that has been, I think, amazing about Shinzen is the way in which he's attempted to create a taxonomy of meditation techniques, a way of categorizing them, but without diluting them, so not homogenizing them, so that they all fit into some artificial way, but giving each technique from each tradition, allowing it to retain its character and its flavor and its instruction set, and even its philosophical view. But to somehow see these in a relationship or a taxonomy, essentially, in which relationships can be seen or contrasts can be appreciated without diluting the individual techniques and views themselves. I think that's pretty special. Of course, you probably know he was trained as a scholar and speaks many of the source languages of those contemplative techniques. So he's, his Chinese, the Sanskrit, fluent in Japanese, etc., etc. So he has that tremendous, obviously, intellect, as well as a scholarly training, as well as a psychonaut. He was heavy into his psychedelics too, as you perhaps know, in his early days. And then he got super into his meditation. I mean, really. And he abandoned the scholarship and just went full on into that. So he's got that kind of interesting mix of IQ, tremendous IQ, but then also this tremendous kind of gung-ho diving in, thing. So amazing. And of course, I met him when he was in his, I suppose, 60s. That's when I met him. So he had a lot of life and done a lot of really amazing things. So all that informs it. He's not purely a theorist. He's a practitioner, but he's not just a practitioner. He also understands the broader philosophical and historical perspectives to an extent, as we're all limited, of course, and in the original languages, in those places, in those cultures, learning those techniques often in those cultures in which they're practiced from masters of those places. So this sort of thing is amazing to me. So I think it's this mixture of, and he's very visionary in the sense that he's attempting always to progress things, and he'll throw his own system out and he'll change his own system in order to iterate the new thing. And I've seen him listen to somebody question him or challenge him in a sort of retreat scenario on something the way he organizes, and then he integrates that, and he's not afraid to do that. So yeah, I think he's really cool, interesting man. Those are some things. So what did I learn from him? Of course, all of that influenced me tremendously. I learned many meditation techniques from him in that context. I did lots and lots of practice with him. I learned a lot about practice itself. I learned a lot about the sorts of path the territory one traverses. He's very multidisciplinary. So we always went on retreats, the ones I did with him in this Catholic retreat center, Palos Verdes. And so we're in this Catholic situation. So very often his Dharma talks would be about T.S. Eliot and Teresa of Avila and Cloud of Unknowing, and much to the irritation, I think, sometimes of people who to come and all you're hearing about is the ancient Renaissance art and mathematics and Catholic mystics and so on, or Jewish spirituality, for example, and yes, of course, Buddhist, Zen, etc. He'd bring all that into. So this also I found tremendously wonderful. This cultural, drawing on the streams of culture and poetry and literature and history, as well as more explicitly religious themes, science, bringing it all in. It's a melting pot of learning and exploration. That was my experience studying with Shinzen. That's an incomplete description, but and he was always teaching us to teach. Also, very often the way he would teach us was by teaching us how to teach it. That was the frame he often took. So he'd teach us techniques, and he'd refer to us almost like we were teachers, which of course, some were and some weren't. But he always, in other words, he's always showing his workings, as we'd say in school. He's showing us how he arrives at the point he's at, or why he says it this way, and why you don't want to say it that way, because that implies this. And so he's giving us how it's done. He's showing us the recipe all the time. I find that, of course, very educational as well. Very educational as well. So non-dogmatic, rigorous practice, intellectually curious, across traditions, across genres. Yeah. So, yeah, wonderful teacher in my experience.
Yeah, that was a beautiful testimonial. Not that Shinzen needs any, but if he needed one, this could have been a good one. And I think,
as they say, experiences may differ. What do they say? Results may differ. Isn't that what you've got to say? You've got to give that caveat. I'm not saying, that everyone will have that experience. You're asking about and it's also part of where you're at in your own life and development, and where the teacher's at. And there's always different, isn't it? The 5 perfections, right? Perfect. Perfect, but perfect teacher, perfect student, perfect time, perfect teaching, perfect place. So these 5 things come together, and it's magical when that happens. And I have a great deal of appreciation for my time. He doesn't teach in-person retreats anymore, so my time in that container was still wonderful. It was so wonderful. I have a great appreciation for that, and indeed other teachers I've had. But if you ask about Shinzen, wow, so influential and wonderful.
Yeah, so I'm mindful of the time, and maybe I could squeeze in one more question. Yeah. Besides for Shinzen Young, out of the other guests you've hosted, which do you feel had the biggest impact, whether in an inspirational way or maybe pragmatically, maybe somehow benefiting your meditation practice? Is there anybody else that really stands out for you?
Well, I must say they all impact me in many ways. But I can say that I've interviewed I have interviewed some of my teachers on that podcast who were my teachers before or around that time. So I've interviewed Godfrey Devereux, for example, and he was I learned yoga from him, and he trained me to be a yoga teacher also. But he was also steeped in Zen, as you learned from his particular interview, Godfrey Devereux. You can look him up. And so we did a lot of meditating, and it was quite deep. And he was not the kind of yoga that not yoga as we know it, Jim. A very different kind of approach to yoga, really coming from, Zen style, awakened perspective, I would say. So I have been lucky to interview him a couple of times. So, of course, he was very influential because I studied with him for several years before I even had a podcast. A very interesting guy, and there've been others too. Glenn Mullen, he was has been influential in some ways. I mean, I can't really choose. I mean, they're also one. I mean, Glenn Mullen, I don't want to diminish that. Very influential, I should say. Very influential indeed. But many of them have been. I mean, just being lucky enough to spend an hour or two with some of these people is, I think, always wonderful. And if I interview them again and again, sometimes some guests I'll interview them again and again, and you get to spend even more time with them, and you ask them whatever you like and communicate with them, and it's wonderful. You can't help but be enriched by that, I think. So I really do think that all my guests have enriched me as a person by virtue of spending time with them.
Yeah, I think your podcast is enriching all of us. Just a lot of wisdom and a lot of different perspectives, and I think just the guests, like a lot of these guests, I haven't seen anywhere else. I have never heard of them before or seen them before. One that really stands out for me, like Belson Armstrong, that's been like really interesting to kind of see him and have him talk and have him come on and speak with Daniel Ingram. And I like how you bring people together too and have like debates and just, yeah. And just like the way you interview, like, just like you have this rigorous style, like just like, let's get to the deeper level of truth, give us a little more information, and just like a very disciplined, committed way of interviewing and just being very present. Like, you often won't even share anything about yourself. That's why I actually also wanted to speak to you, because like, you know, if the guest ever like throws it back into your court, you'll just say usually like one or two things and just cut it off. I'm just like, wow, I can't be that disciplined. I like to talk way too much. Like, I got to say something too. But yeah, I really appreciate the show. I really appreciate what you've been doing. And it's fascinating. It's valuable, and it's unique. It's different. Yeah. So thanks so much for that.
Oh, thank you, Artem. That's very kind of you to say. It means a lot.
Yeah, and thanks so much for coming on here and being on this show. And hopefully we get to speak again, because I have so many other questions. There's just so many layers to your life, and I'm just excited to see where your journey takes you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd be happy to come back.
All right, Steve. Thanks a lot, and take care.